It began as the kind of afternoon no one remembers until something forces them to. The kind of day that blends into the rhythm of a small suburban town, where the biggest sound in the air is the distant hum of cars and the soft echo of children running across wooden play structures. Spring had only just settled in, coating Lot 10 Park in warm sunlight and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Families spread across the open space without a trace of urgency, strollers parked under young maple trees, toddlers waddling in circles, teenagers passing a soccer ball back and forth on the far field. Nothing suggested that anything unusual was waiting to happen. Evan Marshall had been there with his mother for nearly an hour. He was 3 years old, small for his age, with soft blonde hair that curled behind his ears when he ran. His mother, Lauren, had chosen Lot 10 Park because it was familiar, predictable, and close enough to home that she could pack up and leave at any moment if Evan grew tired or fussy. The park was considered safe in a way people rarely questioned. It sat between two cul-de-sacs and a quiet residential road, a place where parents often chatted with strangers as if they had known each other for years. It was the kind of park where people left bicycles unlocked simply because they always had. In the first hour, everything about the day followed that script. Evan chased bubbles blown by another child. He climbed the small yellow slide meant for toddlers. He tugged at the sleeve of his mother's jacket, asking for another cracker. And Lauren, like many parents distracted by the mental weight of everyday life, checked her phone once or twice to answer a message about a doctor's appointment. There was nothing unusual about any of it. Witnesses later said the same thing. It was an ordinary afternoon, the type that shouldn't have held any danger. They remembered the laughter, the squeaking of swings, the way the sunlight flickered through the leaves when the breeze picked up. One mother remembered the ice cream cart that rolled slowly along the paved path, the little bell chiming every few seconds as the vendor looked for customers. Another recalled a man sitting alone on a bench near the middle of the park, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No one saw anything threatening about him. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't watching any child too closely, wasn't approaching families. He was just another person filling another silent space. That, perhaps, was what made what happened next so hard to understand. Lauren would later try to count the seconds, but shock makes memory slippery. She had turned toward the stroller, Evan's stroller, the one parked beside her for something small and forgettable. Some parents said it looked like she was tucking something into the bag underneath. Others said they saw her pick up a water bottle. One person thought she stepped toward the garbage bin a few feet away. These small contradictions would matter later, but in the moment, no one noticed them. What mattered was that she looked away for what she believed was less than a minute. When she looked back, the space where Evan had been standing was empty. At first, nothing inside her registered fear. Parents lose sight of their kids for seconds every day. Toddlers wander behind slides or trees or other children, chasing something small and interesting that adults don't see. Lauren instinctively scanned the immediate area, expecting him to appear from behind the play structure or step out from the shadow cast by the maple tree. She called his name gently at first, then louder, as she walked a few steps toward the sandbox where he sometimes liked to dig. When she reached the sandbox and didn't see him, something inside her shifted. It wasn't panic yet, just a jolt, a quiet pressure building behind the ribs, the mind trying to keep the moment small but unable to fully silence the rising alarm. She called his name again, louder this time. A father nearby paused mid-conversation and looked up. A teenager stopped kicking the soccer ball. People who had not noticed Evan at all earlier suddenly began scanning the park for a little blonde boy, because something in Lauren's voice suggested she wasn't calling casually anymore. Only 3 minutes had passed. But 3 minutes was all it took for the mood of Lot 10 Park to change. Parents stood from blankets. Children were pulled closer. A few people started walking the perimeter of the playground, checking behind benches, behind the bathroom building, near the small grove of shrubs that lined the north edge. More than one person assumed Evan had followed the ice cream vendor, drawn by the bell, but when they waved him down on the path, the vendor shook his head and said he hadn't seen any child alone. His cart bell chimed again, softer now, sounding strangely out of place. Lauren's voice cracked when she yelled his name again, and it was then that everyone understood this wasn't an ordinary misplacement of a child. In the confusion, Witness accounts began forming details that would later prove frustrating to investigators. One woman insisted she remembered the stroller facing east toward the playground. Another swore it had been angled toward the paved path. Someone else believed they saw Evan walking toward the bench where the man in the baseball cap had been sitting. But another mother insisted she had watched Evan climb the slide only moments before he vanished. Small contradictions, insignificant at first, slowly became the only threads anyone had. A young couple searching the grassy field waved their hands, shouting that they didn't see anything. A father jogged toward the far edge where a chain-link fence separated the park from a sloping drainage ditch, but there was no sign of movement. Every adult kept expecting to stumble on the simple explanation: Evan crouched behind a tree, Evan watching ants near the picnic tables, Evan wandering toward the soccer field. But each hopeful direction came up empty, and with each passing minute, the silence around Lauren grew heavier. She kept walking in circles, calling his name through tears now, her voice raw and cracking. People tried to comfort her, but comfort meant nothing when minutes felt like they were slipping into something darker. Someone pulled out a phone and dialed emergency services. Another ran toward the parking lot to check if Evan had somehow wandered there. The park, once filled with easy movement and small talk, now felt suffocating. Within 10 minutes, sirens could be heard in the distance. That sound approaching, rising, closing, it confirmed everyone's worst fear. Evan was truly missing. Not wandering, not exploring, not momentarily distracted, missing. Parents held their children closer. Strangers who had barely looked at one another earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder, searching the edges of the park like a single unit. But no matter how many people moved, no matter how many voices called, nothing changed the single terrifying fact: there was no sign of Evan. Police officers arrived quickly, moving through the crowd with a calm urgency learned from years of similar calls, though something about a missing toddler always brought a different weight to their expressions. They asked rapid questions. What color were his clothes? Which direction was he facing? Who saw him last? How long had he been gone? As officers recorded statements, the contradictions became clearer. It wasn't just the stroller's position. Some parents insisted Evan had been playing near the swings minutes earlier. Others remembered seeing him near the sandbox. And no one could agree on whether he had been walking alone or holding something. A park that was supposed to be simple had become a maze of conflicting memories. The officer in charge ordered an immediate grid search, splitting volunteers and officers into sections of the park. K-9 units were requested. More patrol cars were on the way. But the longer the search went on without even the smallest clue, the heavier the atmosphere became. The man with the baseball cap couldn't be found among the crowd anymore, and though no one had thought of him as suspicious at first, his unexplained departure soon cast a shadow over the earliest minutes of the search. The truth, whatever it was, seemed buried in those initial seconds when Lauren had looked away. Seconds that now replayed in her memory like a broken loop, each repetition making the gaps deeper, harder to fill, harder to trust. She kept insisting Evan had been beside her, within arm's reach, that she had looked down at the stroller and then looked up and he was just gone. Some parents nodded sympathetically. Others whispered questions under their breath, wondering whether they had really seen the stroller where she claimed it was. A search that should have soothed her only made the air feel more fragile. Officers spread out farther. Someone began checking cars in the parking lot. The ice cream vendor stood with his cart, watching the scene with a strained expression, insisting again that he didn't see anything unusual. And as the first hour slipped into the second, a quiet dread settled over Lot 10 Park, an unspoken realization that whatever had happened to Evan, it had happened fast, quietly, and without leaving a trace. The ordinary afternoon had cracked open into something no one in that small suburban town would ever forget. And though no one knew it yet, the contradictions in those early witness accounts, small, strange, easily dismissed, were the first clues in a mystery that would haunt the community for years. Even then, before theories formed, before searches expanded, before hope and fear became indistinguishable, something in the atmosphere suggested that the truth was already slipping away, hidden in those first chaotic moments when no one realized the importance of what they had seen or what they had missed. In the hours after Evan vanished, the park transformed from a place of weekend calm into the center of an emergency no one was prepared for. Police cordoned off entire sections with yellow tape that fluttered in the rising wind. Officers spoke quietly at first, trying to keep the situation controlled, but missing child calls always carried their own gravity. The stakes were too high, the timeline too fragile. Every minute mattered, and they all felt it. The missing child protocol activated with a force that made the quiet suburban neighborhood feel suddenly foreign. K-9 units arrived first, handlers guiding the dogs toward the patch of grass where Evan had last been seen. The dogs picked up his scent quickly. 3-year-olds aren't delicate presences. Their hands touch everything, their clothes catch the smallest particles of dust, grass, and food. But only minutes into the track, the scent trail began to tangle. The dogs circled, then doubled back, then moved toward the paved path, then stopped entirely. Handlers exchanged looks that were subtle but unmistakable. This was not how a typical track behaved. Toddlers leave messy, direct scent lines. Evans seemed to start, then scatter. Forestry teams arrived next, even though Lot 10 Park wasn't dense enough to be called a forest. The small wooded section on the west end, barely a few acres, was still deep enough to hide a frightened child or a desperate adult. Volunteers combed through it in tight formation, calling Evan's name, their boots brushing through fallen leaves and damp earth. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows between the trees. Every rustle demanded attention. Every snapped twig made someone turn sharply, hopeful, then disappointed. Searchers checked the creek that curled behind the tree line, stirring the cold water with long poles. But the current was too weak and too shallow to offer any real clues. Still, when a child is missing, no possibility is ignored, no matter how improbable. By late afternoon, drones began to lift into the sky. Their quiet hum drifted above rooftops and treetops, scanning the park, the drainage ditches, the open fields, and the rooflines of homes bordering the area. Thermal imaging software highlighted warm spots, rabbits, stray cats, the exhaust of parked cars, but nothing shaped like a child. One operator increased the zoom repeatedly, hoping to catch the slightest movement, but the screens reflected only empty spaces and the dull glow of the setting Sunday. Pond sweeps came next. A shallow retention pond sat at the far end of the neighborhood, still water covered in pollen and the occasional leaf. Divers entered anyway. They checked every inch of the murky basin, emerging each time with nothing. As they climbed out, their suits dripping, the frustration on their faces spoke louder than words. They had expected answers. Answers in water were tragic but concrete. But finding nothing added a different kind of weight. It meant the mystery was expanding, not narrowing. Door-to-door canvassing began as the light faded. Officers moved through the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking about sightings, reviewing home security cameras, and gathering any scrap of information. Some residents had cameras pointed toward their driveways, others toward their porches or the street. Officers collected every file, downloading hours of footage that would take investigators all night to comb through. A few children in the neighborhood recalled seeing a blond boy earlier in the day, but when pressed, none could say whether it was Evan or someone else. Memory was unreliable, especially when fear crept into the edges of it. Investigators checked the list of every vehicle parked near the park that afternoon. They ran plates, tracked owners, and pulled up local surveillance systems from nearby stores, traffic lights, and gas stations. Every car entering or leaving the area within a 2-hour window was logged. One sedan had left shortly after Evan disappeared, but the owner, a local contractor, quickly proved he had been picking up tools. Another vehicle, a white pickup, caught attention only because it slowed near the park before turning away. But when officers found the driver, he explained he had been using GPS and missed his turn. Every lead that initially looked like a thread unraveled into something ordinary. By dusk, media trucks lined the street. News anchors whispered in somber tones about the missing toddler, their faces illuminated by harsh camera lights. The Marshall family was thrust into the center of attention before they had time to comprehend what had happened. Lauren sat in the back of a patrol car for a while, trembling, answering the same questions repeatedly. Her husband arrived an hour after the first call, pale and shaking, his voice too weak at first to form words. Detectives searched their home with quiet respect. They moved through bedrooms, hallways, and the living room with deliberate efficiency. Missing child investigations always begin close, no matter how unlikely the cause. But nothing in the house suggested trouble. Evan's room was filled with toys and picture books. The kitchen held an unfinished grocery list on the counter. There were no signs of struggle, no tension between the parents, no history that might raise suspicion. Detectives ruled them out quickly, but the media didn't move on as easily. Headlines, even subtle ones, hinted at the possibility of parental involvement. It wasn't malice, just the nature of public fear looking for something solid to blame. Inside the command post set up near the park, investigators layered maps on folding tables, marking areas that had been searched and those that still needed to be cleared. Theories circulated quietly. If Evan had wandered, he should have been found by now. If he had been taken, there should have been some sign, a car peeling away, a scream, an object dropped in haste. But there was nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single footprint that didn't belong to someone already accounted for. Interviews continued into the night. Joggers who often passed through the park claimed they hadn't seen anything out of place. A woman walking her dog remembered the ice cream cart, the laughter of children, and a moment when her dog pulled sharply on the leash as if distracted, but she couldn't recall where Evan had been at that time. Teenagers at the basketball court insisted they hadn't noticed anything strange, though some admitted they hadn't been paying attention. People remembered fragments, details delivered with uncertainty, flashes of moments only half formed. And in those gaps, the investigators felt the pressure tighten. Cell tower triangulation offered another angle. Officers pulled phone logs from everyone in the area during the window when Evan disappeared. They checked for unusual pings, devices that moved strangely or turned off at suspicious times, but nothing stood out. Every phone belonged to someone who had already been interviewed or someone with a benign explanation. The data looked clean, too clean for a chaotic disappearance. By midnight, fatigue and fear spread through the search teams. Flashlights bobbed along the trails surrounding the park, long lines of volunteers pushing into the dark, hoping to find something, anything that would break the silence growing heavier by the hour. But nature offered no clues. The birds had gone quiet. The air felt colder than the early forecast predicted. Someone mentioned that missing children cases often hinge on the first 12 hours, and the reminder twisted like a knife in everyone's thoughts. At the Marshall home, relatives gathered in the living room, whispering prayers and updates. Evan's father held his son's favorite stuffed dinosaur so tightly his knuckles stayed white. Lauren kept replaying the moment she looked away, convinced that if she could just remember one detail more clearly, everything would make sense. But memory under trauma is unreliable, clouded by shock, softened by fear. She remembered the stroller, the bottle, the position of the bench, the sound of the ice cream bell, the laughter of children around her, but none of it formed a coherent answer, and that uncertainty only fed her guilt. Back at the park, the search boundaries expanded another half-mile. Officers checked storm drains, backyards, sheds, crawl spaces underneath porches. They scanned rooftops with thermal cameras again, though no one truly expected a 3-year-old to climb that high. Investigators began considering the possibility that Evan had been taken from the park and brought somewhere else entirely. It was the theory they least wanted to consider, but the one they could no longer ignore. Yet even that theory had problems. Abductions in broad daylight almost always leave noise witnesses describing a struggle, a shout, a flinch from a passerby. But Lot 10 Park had stayed strangely calm, as if whatever happened occurred beneath the notice of dozens of eyes. It didn't make sense, and that lack of sense became the most unsettling aspect of the entire case. The longer investigators searched, the clearer it became that they were missing something essential, a piece of the puzzle that hadn't been recognized, or a detail buried under conflicting memories. Theories split between teams. Some believed Evan had wandered into an area that searchers had somehow overlooked. Others suspected a targeted abduction by someone who planned carefully enough to leave without drawing attention. A few entertained the more unsettling possibility that whatever happened was fast, silent, and untraceable in a way that defied the usual patterns. Hours passed. The night deepened. The temperature dropped. But despite the overwhelming effort, despite dogs, drones, divers, and the growing desperation of an entire town, there was still no sign of Evan. Not a footprint in soft earth. Not a fabric thread snagged on a branch. Not a single confirmed sighting. And as dawn approached, casting pale light over a park that had been searched more thoroughly than any place in the county's recent history, the horrifying truth settled in. Children leave traces Avon had left known. The absence itself became the loudest clue, a chilling realization that suggested the next phase of the investigation would be darker, more complicated, and far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Because a toddler does not simply disappear into nothing. And yet, somehow, that was exactly what had happened. Weeks passed without progress, and the investigation settled into a rhythm that felt more like endurance than hope. Detectives tracked leads methodically, but the absence of new evidence left them trapped in the same loop: interviews, re-interviews, searches, revisits. And yet, despite the stagnation, the case refused to fade. People still whispered about the toddler who vanished without leaving a trace. Parents watched their children with renewed caution. Joggers no longer wore headphones near the woods. Even regulars at Lot 10 Park admitted feeling unsettled, as if the ground itself had become unfamiliar. Then a tip came in from a teenager who had spent most afternoons skateboarding near the park. He mentioned a man he'd seen repeatedly, someone who sat on a bench close to the playground, usually alone, always quiet. The teen said the man wasn't doing anything overtly strange, but he came at odd hours, often when the park was nearly empty. Investigators leaned in at that part. Predators sometimes lingered in plain sight, blending into the background of everyday life. The teen didn't have a name or an exact description, but he remembered a baseball cap and a posture that seemed too still, too deliberate. Detectives wrote everything down, even the hesitations between the teen's sentences, because in cases like this, hesitation sometimes held the most truth. Another witness stepped forward a few days later, a mother who recalled a similar man months earlier, offering candy to children near the sandpit. At the time, she dismissed him as an overly friendly local who didn't understand boundaries. But now the memory pressed against her with new urgency. She described an average build, neutral clothing, and a tone that was gentle but strangely insistent. She had ushered her children away without making a scene, chalking it up to a harmless interaction. Now, she wasn't so sure. The details she provided weren't enough to form a composite, but they were enough to raise the question of whether this man had been watching the park long before Evan disappeared. Investigators began digging through the registry of known offenders in the area. They studied individuals living within a 5-mile radius, cross-referencing past incidents with park proximity and possible schedules. Some names stood out: men with histories of public indecency, attempted luring, or stalking, but none had alibis that broke. One had been at work during the time Evan vanished. Another was confirmed to be out of state. A third was bedridden following a surgery. Detectives expanded the search to include drifters known to camp near the river trails, as well as seasonal workers who passed through town for short-term jobs. A few of them had concerning histories: arrests for trespassing, possessions of weapons, erratic behavior, but again, nothing linked them to the park that afternoon. The more people they screened, the more the investigation widened into an overwhelming network of maybes. There were too many vague possibilities and not enough certainty. Each new name led to a short trail of questions, then ended abruptly with an alibi, a time card, or a verified witness account. Investigators found themselves returning to the same board, the same photos, the same map dotted with search grids, wondering how a 3-year-old could vanish in a place where so many lives overlapped. Meanwhile, Evan's father was coming undone under the weight of his own thoughts. Guilt had become a quiet force inside him, one that grew stronger as days slipped into weeks. He began returning to Lot 10 Park every night, long after search teams had gone home. Sometimes he walked the perimeter. Sometimes he stood near the bench where Lauren last saw their son. He retraced steps, studied the ground, stared into the dark as if expecting a shape to emerge. He convinced himself that he had missed something: a sound, a movement, a detail overlooked in those frantic first minutes. It didn't matter how many times detectives reassured him that he wasn't at fault. His mind replayed the moment as though rewriting it could change its outcome. Neighbors saw him but rarely approached. There was something raw about him, an exhaustion that settled deep into his voice, a hollow look that made even well-meaning words feel inadequate. Some nights he stayed until dawn, unable to leave. Other nights he left abruptly, as if the silence had become too heavy to bear. The park had once been a place where his son learned to run, where sunlight filtered through oak branches onto soft grass. Now it felt like a place haunted by questions that refused to answer themselves. As the investigation widened, promising leads surfaced but collapsed almost immediately. A reported sighting at a gas station 40 miles away sent officers rushing there, reviewing security footage and interviewing clerks. A small, blond child had been seen holding a man's hand near the coffee machine. But when the man was identified, it turned out to be his nephew visiting from another town. The resemblance was uncanny, but not meaningful. Another false alarm. A stroller found deep in the woods seemed at first like a breakthrough. It was muddy, abandoned, wrapped in leaves and brush. But it belonged to a woman who had discarded it months earlier after it broke. She provided receipts, photos, and even old text messages complaining about how much she hated the stroller. The proximity had felt too symbolic to ignore, but in truth, it had nothing to do with Evan. Then there was a man matching the witness description caught on a motel camera along the highway. Detectives watched the footage repeatedly, analyzing his build, posture, and movements. He wore a baseball cap, walked with a slight hunch, and kept his hands in his pockets. For a moment, there was hope, but when he was located, he turned out to be a trucker passing through the state. He had never visited Lot 10 Park and had no connection to the town. Another lead that lifted spirits briefly before dropping them back into uncertainty. Each collapse didn't just erase a lead, it eroded confidence. Investigators felt it first, then the family, then the community. With every dead end, the sense of something hidden just out of reach grew sharper. It wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the strange stillness surrounding the case, as if whatever had happened had been executed with an unsettling level of intent. That suspicion deepened when a detective examining the maintenance road behind the park noticed something odd. Faint tire impressions pressed into the dirt near a section that should have been unused. Maintenance trucks went through periodically, but these tracks didn't match their tread patterns. They also seemed too narrow, like a smaller vehicle had rolled through quietly, avoiding the main entrance. The impressions suggested a slow, deliberate exit rather than a quick getaway. Yet when investigators expanded the search along the road's length, the ground grew harder, the tracks fading until they disappeared entirely. Nearby, a broken fence panel caught attention. It was splintered at the bottom, pushed inward slightly, and seemed recently disturbed. But there were no footprints, no scraps of clothing clinging to the edges, no fingerprints on the wood. It offered more questions than answers. If someone had slipped through there, they had either been careful or lucky, and if they had used it as an escape route, it meant they understood the park well enough to navigate its blind spots. Detectives reviewed the area's geography again, studying how sightlines narrowed at certain angles and widened at others. A blind corner formed by dense hedges created a section where someone could briefly be hidden from view, even during daylight. A bench positioned near a slope created another subtle pocket of invisibility. None of these were obvious, but to someone who had spent time in the park, someone who studied its rhythms, they could become opportunities. This realization shifted the tone of the investigation. What if Evan's disappearance wasn't random? What if it wasn't a moment of chance, but a moment someone had prepared for quietly, patiently, until the right afternoon arrived? The thought unsettled even experienced officers. Random disappearances left trails. They left commotion, hesitation, or accidental clues. Planned acts, truly planned ones, left silence. That silence now felt deliberate. The more detectives examined the subtle anomalies, the tire impressions, the fence panel, the repositioned branches that didn't match natural growth, the stronger the suspicion grew that someone had used the park's overlooked spaces with intent. Someone who knew how to disappear without disrupting the noise of families, strollers, and afternoon conversations. Someone who had moved through Lot 10 Park not as a visitor, but as a shadow. And though investigators couldn't yet prove it, a chilling possibility began pressing forward. Someone might have been preparing for a moment like this long before Evan arrived that day. Someone who might still be nearby. Someone who might be watching. And that terrifying thought would soon push the investigation toward a direction no one had expected and force detectives to question whether the earliest witnesses had overlooked far more than they realized. 6 years pass in a way that doesn't feel like years at all, more like a slow unraveling of a life that once felt predictable, safe, ordinary. The town learns to move around the empty space Evan left behind, stepping carefully around it the same way people instinctively avoid a memorial on the side of the road. Lot 10 Park regains its routine rhythms, but something in the air never fully returns to normal. Parents keep a closer hold on their children without openly acknowledging why. Teenagers who were young kids at the time of the disappearance now walk past the playground with a faint, uneasy memory they can't fully explain. Even the maintenance staff sometimes pause near the swings, aware that 6 years earlier, this was the last place a 3-year-old was seen before he simply vanished, into the kind of silence that feels too heavy for a town this small. Evan's mother tries, for the first month, to pretend life can continue with a form of structure. She keeps his clothes folded in his dresser, washes his favorite blanket even when no one has touched it, and opens the blinds in his room every morning as if sunlight might somehow guide him back. But as months turn into years, her rituals become less like hope and more like a defense mechanism. The room becomes a preserved space, untouched, frozen in time, the way parents sometimes hold on to the last set of footprints in a carpet. Birthdays are the hardest. She keeps buying a cake, even when relatives gently suggest that maybe it would be healthier to stop. She can't. She lights 3 candles the first year, 4 the next, then 5, until eventually the candles become symbols no one can look at for long. Her family begins tiptoeing around the topic, speaking Evan's name only when she does. They don't want to reopen wounds that never healed in the first place. His father handles the grief differently, slipping quietly out of conversations, avoiding long gatherings, withdrawing from anything that asks him to pretend life is normal. His coworkers notice first when he starts missing shifts. Then he stops responding to texts. The excuses become less plausible, the anxiety more visible. Before long, he takes leave from his job, officially temporary. But everyone knows what it means. He spends his evenings driving routes around the park, checking the wooded edges, retracing trails worn shallow by years of search teams. He never truly looks up when someone waves. His gaze stays fixed on the tree line, as if something there has been calling him back since the day Evan disappeared. Over time, worry turns into obsession. He knows every surveillance angle of nearby businesses, every access road on the outskirts of the park, every maintenance route the city stopped using decades earlier. He never admits it, but sometimes he wanders those paths long after the sun has set, listening for anything, a sound, a memory, a possibility. Extended family tries to offer stability, but grief behaves like gravity. It pulls them all toward different emotional orbits. Evan's grandparents alternate between trying to comfort their daughter and searching for information on missing child cases in other states, convinced there must be patterns they can recognize. A cousin sets up a yearly vigil at the park, lighting candles along the path leading toward the woods, but attendance shrinks with each passing year. People don't forget. Exactly, they just learn to coexist with unanswered questions. The community's initial wave of support slowly dissolves into something more muted, a quiet sympathy that no longer makes the news or fills town meetings. After a while, when strangers ask about the case, locals respond with a tone somewhere between discomfort and resignation, as if they're speaking about a shadow everyone sees, but no one truly understands anymore. Investigators, too, carry the weight of the unsolved disappearance, though their involvement becomes sporadic rather than constant. The original detectives gradually rotate into new roles, retire, or move to other jurisdictions. Fresh officers inherit the case every few years, opening the files with the same curiosity and determination the first team had, only to find that time has erased more answers than it has revealed. They analyze the old witness statements, but the contradictions remain. The stroller position that didn't align with 2 accounts, the man on the bench described differently by 3 different people, the direction Evan was reportedly walking in that never led anywhere useful. With every anniversary, someone rechecks the tips that once seemed promising, but the trail grows colder each time. The park surveillance footage still contains the same maddeningly ordinary moments: the ice cream cart passing, toddlers running, a baseball cap shielding the face of a man who might be no one at all. Every possibility seems to crumble upon closer examination. The sporadic leads that emerge over the years give just enough hope to reopen old scars. A woman claims she saw a little boy at a Walmart 2 states away with a man who didn't look like his father. Investigators reach out, collect information, and send officers to review the security footage. The boy is identified within hours as a local child shopping with his uncle. Another tip arrives from a bus passenger who swears she overheard a conversation that sounded like a confession, two people whispering about a kid in the park. Detectives track down the individuals, only to find they were discussing a viral documentary they had watched days earlier. Each lead collapses under the weight of reality, leaving the family emotionally exhausted. Then there is the quiet tip from a postal worker who thought she recognized Evan's face in a group of kids boarding a school bus near a rural community. She insists the boy had the same eyes, the same round-faced smile. Investigators treat it seriously, combing through school records, interviewing drivers, and checking nearby homes. The boy is eventually identified, and once again the resemblance proves coincidental. By this point, each false lead feels less like a possibility and more like a reminder that the real trail has remained dead for years. Public interest follows a predictable curve. At first, the story dominates headlines, with news vans gathering outside the park and reporters shadowing investigators. But as months pass with no answers, coverage shrinks. By year 3, only small anniversary segments appear on local stations. By year 5, those too begin to fade. Evan's disappearance becomes something the town recalls in low voices, a story newcomers hear only in fragments. Online discussions decrease. The flyers posted around town weather in the sun, their edges curling, their colors fading. Some are taken down by the city. Others remain cracked beneath layers of tape, as if refusing to surrender to the passage of time. Yet, beneath the silence that settles over the case, something else lingers, an uneasy sense among investigators that the park itself has never been fully understood. Tiny anomalies from the early days of the search still gnaw at the few detectives who remain familiar with the details. The tire impressions near the restricted maintenance road, recorded on paper but never matched to a specific vehicle. The broken fence panel behind the old storage shed, brushed off as routine wear but strangely clean along the brake line, as if it had been manipulated, not simply damaged. The fact that someone could have used the wooded blind spots without anyone noticing during the chaos of the initial search. None of these details individually amounted to solid evidence, but together, they formed a quiet pattern, one that seemed to hint at intention. The father, in one of his late-night returns to the park, pauses near the maintenance road without knowing why. He notices the way the trees create a corridor of shadows not visible from most of the playground. He walks the length of it, stopping where the fence meets the old maintenance building. He wonders, not for the first time, whether someone had stood in this exact place 6 years earlier, unseen, waiting. The thought almost breaks him, but he keeps returning, compelled by the possibility that the truth may still be hiding in the park's forgotten corners. Detectives who review the case years later also feel drawn to these small irregularities. One young investigator, assigned to look into old cold cases, reads through the first-day reports and senses something off, not because of what is written, but because of what isn't. He notes that the footprints found near the base of the hill were dismissed quickly, assumed to belong to search volunteers. He wonders why the tire impressions were never revisited when new technology became available. He studies the map of the park and notices blind spots between the cameras, places where someone familiar with the layout could move undetected. He doesn't have proof, only intuition, but it's enough to keep him thinking about the case long after his shift ends. Still, the town begins to accept a painful truth, that some disappearances remain unsolved, suspended in a space where answers exist but remain unreachable. The silence becomes part of the community's identity. The swings continue to creak in the wind. The trail paths deepen with every season of joggers and dog walkers. Children play under the watchful eyes of parents who never forget what happened here, even when they don't mention it aloud. And yet, time has a way of preserving things no one expects. Deep beneath the park's noise, beneath years of footsteps and weather and seasonal cleanup, something waits, a detail overlooked, a piece of the story the search teams never uncovered, something small but crucial. It has been there since the day Evan disappeared, sealed quietly in the earth or hidden in the structure of the park itself. And when it finally surfaces, it will pull everything 6 years of grief, questions, assumptions into sharp, undeniable clarity, exposing what really happened on that warm spring afternoon. 6 years after Evan's disappearance, when most people in town had stopped expecting any new development at all, the discovery began in the most ordinary way imaginable. A retired widower named Charles Dixon took his daily morning walk with his aging beagle, Murphy, along a forgotten trail behind Lot 10 Park. Charles had walked that route for years, using it as a quiet escape from the busier paths, the ones filled with joggers and families. The trail had grown increasingly overgrown, its edges swallowed by thorny brush and fallen branches, but he liked that about it. It reminded him of older days, untouched by the hurried pace the town had adopted over time. He never thought of the trail as connected to the case that had haunted the town. He had always assumed Evan's disappearance had nothing to do with this part of the park. For him, it was simply a peaceful place where Murphy could sniff the ground without being interrupted. On this particular morning, Murphy's behavior changed in a way Charles couldn't ignore. The dog suddenly stiffened, tail raised in a way that Charles hadn't seen in years. Instead of his usual meandering pace, Murphy lunged toward a thick tangle of brush near a fallen tree. Charles tried to tug him back, assuming the dog had gotten distracted by the scent of a squirrel or maybe a raccoon. But Murphy pushed harder, digging his paws into the soil, whining in a frantic, insistent way. Charles reluctantly followed, bending down and clearing aside branches as Murphy began pawing at the dirt with an urgency that didn't feel normal at all. It wasn't the curious digging dogs sometimes do. It was something sharper, more focused, like the dog had detected something that shouldn't have been there. The earth beneath the fallen tree was soft, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been disturbed recently despite the surrounding area being untouched for years. Murphy's paws scraped against something hard, and a small object rolled toward Charles's shoe. When he reached down and brushed away the remaining dirt, his breath caught in his throat. Resting in his palm was a tiny, faded sneaker, worn at the edges, but unmistakably a child's shoe. It looked old, weathered by time and the elements, yet oddly intact. The color had faded to a muted shade, but the outline, the stitching, the size, it all felt eerily familiar. Charles had seen the missing posters for years, walked past the memorials, watched the vigils. He knew this shoe was not something a random child had left behind. Something about it carried a weight, a history, a connection to the unanswered questions that had hung over the town for so long. He contacted the police with trembling hands, barely able to articulate what he had found. Within minutes, officers arrived and sealed off the area. Investigators who hadn't stepped foot in that part of the park in years now scoured every inch of the trail, moving with a level of intensity that suggested they understood the significance of the discovery immediately. Crime scene technicians cordoned off the fallen tree, kneeling in the dirt with flashlights and small brushes, treating the ground with the kind of care usually reserved for fresh crime scenes. The shoe was placed gently into an evidence bag, tagged, and rushed to the lab. Everyone on the scene felt the same unspoken question settle into the air. After 6 years of silence, why had something belonging to Evan suddenly surfaced now? When forensic results came back, the confirmation hit like a shockwave. The shoe belonged to Evan. The match was unquestionable. The stitching pattern, the size, the brand, the small scuff on the toe, everything lined up perfectly with what Evan had been wearing on the day he disappeared. Investigators, many of whom had worked the original case or had grown up hearing about it, felt a mix of disbelief, relief, and dread. After years of searching surrounding woods, storm drains, abandoned properties, and miles of terrain, the first real piece of evidence had been lying beneath a tree in an area that had once been considered too minor, too obscure, to yield anything meaningful. As the forensic team continued examining the site, something even more unsettling surfaced. Beneath the fallen tree, beneath the dense web of roots, they uncovered a narrow crawl space just wide enough for a child or a crouching adult to maneuver through. The hollow space seemed natural at first, the sort of cavity that forms when a tree's roots pull upward during a storm. But as investigators brushed away more soil and debris, it became clear that this space had been manipulated by human hands. The dirt inside was not compacted the way untouched earth should be. It had been moved, rearranged, disturbed. The debris found inside bits of old cloth, a rusted bottle cap, fragments of plastic suggested that someone had used this space deliberately, perhaps to hide something or someone. The shoe's position added even more questions. It wasn't buried deep, as it would have been if time alone had swallowed it. Instead, the shallow covering of soil suggested placement, not natural decay. Investigators noted that the shoe looked as if it had been intentionally tucked beneath a layer of dirt in the crawlspace, almost like someone wanted it to be found but not immediately. The location itself, tucked behind thick brush, shielded from the main part of the park, added to the growing theory that whoever placed it there had understood the area intimately. The crawlspace went unnoticed during the initial search because it fell within a rarely examined maintenance zone, a spot marked on early maps, but eventually dismissed as low priority. With thousands of volunteers and professionals combing the park in those frantic early days, the small trail behind the maintenance shed had simply been overlooked, overshadowed by larger, more obvious search sectors. Once the discovery became public, the town unraveled emotionally. For 6 years, many residents had forced themselves to stop hoping for updates, to keep the wound covered. The news that Evan's shoe had surfaced intact, recognizable, and clearly placed brought back all the grief they had pushed aside. Parents who had once taken part in the search efforts felt a renewed sense of guilt, wondering whether they had walked past that exact spot without realizing it. Others felt fear settle in their stomachs, realizing that someone, somewhere, had returned to the park after the search died down. The unanswered question loomed. Why would anyone come back to hide something 6 years later? The family's reaction was fractured. Evan's mother collapsed into tears when detectives showed her the photograph of the shoe. She touched the screen as if trying to trace the outline with her fingertip, trying to connect to the child she had convinced herself might still be alive somewhere. Evan's father went silent, staring at the image for a long time without saying a word. He had spent years walking through that park at night, searching the edges, following trails, listening for any sign, any whisper of hope. The idea that he might have been within feet of something important all along was almost too painful to process. Yet beneath the anguish, a new fire ignited within him, one fueled by the certainty that this was not a random discovery. This was intentional. Someone had placed that shoe, and whoever did it held the truth he had been chasing for 6 years. Investigators dove into the next steps with renewed urgency. They re-examined early maps of the park, focusing on maintenance zones and blind spots previously overlooked. The maintenance road behind the fallen tree had been used infrequently by park staff and remained relatively hidden, allowing someone familiar with the terrain to move undetected. Questions resurfaced about the early eyewitness accounts: a man in a baseball cap sitting alone, seen on different days at unusual hours. Detectives began asking themselves whether he had been using these hidden routes long before anyone noticed him. The forensic team's analysis of the crawlspace raised even more disturbing possibilities. Soil displacement patterns suggested that it had been disturbed on more than one occasion. Layers indicated interventions years apart, hinting that someone might have returned at least twice, once during the early years of the investigation, and again more recently. The shoe, based on its wear and soil pattern, appeared to have been placed at the second disturbance. That meant someone had revisited the site long after the search teams had left, long after public interest had died down. Someone who felt confident enough to move unnoticed in an area most people rarely stepped into. Detectives found themselves rethinking the entire timeline, revisiting the possibility that Evan's disappearance had not been a chaotic, random event, but rather a deliberate act carried out by someone who understood how to exploit the park's blind spots. The discovery of the shoe shifted the focus from the question that had haunted the town for years, "Where did Evan go?" to a question that carried far more weight. Who came back to hide this? As officers expanded the search perimeter, they found themselves stepping into parts of the park untouched for years, areas thick with undergrowth and quiet in a way that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. They knew what the community didn't. Objects belonging to missing children don't reappear on their own. Someone had kept that shoe, kept it safe from the elements, then returned to hide it, almost as if placing a marker. And the deeper detectives dug into that possibility, the more they realized that the person who returned to hide the shoe might not have been trying to bury the evidence forever. They might have been trying to send a message, one that would force the investigation back to life. One thing became clear. The silence of the past 6 years was over. The park, once a symbol of unanswered grief, now held a trail that someone thought had gone unnoticed. And as detectives followed it deeper into the maintenance zone, they began to understand that the truth they had searched for all those years had not been lost, only hidden, waiting for the moment someone chose to reveal just enough to change everything. The deeper investigators dug, the more the discovery in the ravine forced them to revisit things they once dismissed. Old statements, early witness accounts, and the unfocused surveillance logs from the park's entrance were brought back into a room that suddenly felt smaller than it used to. The case file that had gathered 6 years of dust was reopened, spread across the table piece by piece, as if the truth had been hiding somewhere between those pages the entire time. From the very beginning, there had been a mention, brief, almost insignificant, of a man seen near the picnic area the morning Evan disappeared. It had been reported by an elderly couple who struggled to remember details, describing him only as someone who didn't look like he belonged there. At the time, officers assumed he was just another hiker. No one had a reason to believe he mattered. But now, with the dog's discovery pointing toward deliberate burial rather than an accident, that vague early description took on new weight. It was reviewed again, slowly, word by word, until an analyst noticed something strange. A matching mention from a different statement given by a teenage volunteer ranger who remembered seeing a maintenance guy, but not one of ours. He wasn't listed on staff. He wasn't on any roster. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. Surveillance from the park entrance hadn't been fully digitized back then, and much of it was degraded. But this time, with better software and more urgency, investigators combed through every fragment. On the feed from the west gate, a camera nearly dismissed due to glare, they finally found him. A man in work boots and a faded uniform shirt walked past the boundary sign at 8:13 a.m. The timestamp was chilling. It was less than 10 minutes before Evan wandered away from the picnic table. The man kept his head down, as if avoiding the camera. He carried a toolkit, but investigators later noted the bag sagged strangely, as though weighted by something that didn't belong in a set of tools. The face was unclear, but his posture, his movement, his presence, it suddenly shifted the entire narrative. A cross-check with employment records revealed the truth. He wasn't a park worker, but his name appeared elsewhere. A former maintenance contractor who had worked in several parks across 2 states, dismissed quietly years earlier, after accusations never proven of attempting to lure a child near a trailhead. No charges were filed. No follow-up had ever been done. He simply left the job, moved on, and blended into the background somewhere else. His name was Mark Ridley, and he had vanished from the area just months after Evan did. Investigators secured a warrant for anything still connected to him. They didn't expect much. 6 years was a long time, long enough for a man like him to erase everything. But behind an industrial strip on the south side of town, in a storage facility that had repeatedly failed to contact him for overdue payments, officials found his abandoned unit. The lock was rusted, dust coated the latch. It looked empty at first, until they lifted the door. What they stepped into was not a collection of old belongings. It was a place frozen in time. Inside were neatly stacked plastic bins, a camping cot, a folded tarp stained with something that had long dried. But what stopped them cold were the small objects arranged in a box near the back wall, items that shouldn't have been there. Items that had no reason to be connected to a grown man living alone. A stuffed giraffe with a torn ear, a baby rattle with faded bear stickers, a blue blanket with little white stars. They matched what Evan had in his baby photos. They matched what his mother remembered packing away when he turned 5, long before the day he went missing. And when a search dog was brought into the unit, it went straight to that blanket. It sat beside it, stiff and alert, its silent confirmation more devastating than any spoken word. Investigators found journals, too small, leather notebooks filled with cramped handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane ramblings, but a few sent a tremor through everyone who read them. One line appeared more than once. "A child who trusts too easily is a gift no one understands." It wasn't a confession, not directly, but it was something darker, an echo of a mind that saw innocence as opportunity. The pages described the perfect park, unwatched moments, the quiet of early mornings. Some entries mentioned the shed by the old birch line, a location no one immediately recognized until the oldest staff. Members remembered a small service, shed the conservation department had abandoned years earlier. It was barely a structure anymore, half collapsed, swallowed by vines, and nearly invisible unless someone already knew where to look. When officers visited it, they found scratch marks on the wooden frame that splintered outward, as if pressure had been applied from the inside. A small metal hook lay in the dirt, broken and rusted. Nearby, soil samples suggested the ground had been disturbed long ago. Forensic experts pieced together a horrifying timeline. Evan had likely wandered from the picnic area in a brief window where eyes were elsewhere. Ridley had been nearby, waiting or watching maybe for minutes, maybe longer. He lived and worked quietly enough that no one would question his presence. He knew the park's blind spots, the trails where cameras failed, the routes maintenance workers used. He didn't need force. A soft voice, a calm smile, a claim of authority would have been enough for a child as trusting as Evan. They believed Ridley took him toward the birch-lined shed. The journals implied the boy was kept there briefly. And then, under cover of the dense woods and isolation, Ridley moved him to a hidden campsite he used on weekends, a place no one else knew existed, where he stayed while drifting between seasonal jobs. That campsite became the next search point. It took 2 days of digging in the rocky soil before a team unearthed what remained beneath a shallow grave, concealed with care and covered in the natural debris of 6 passing years. The remains were fragile, small, and incomplete, but enough for dental confirmation. There was no longer any question. Evan never left the community. He had been here the entire time, hidden under the forest floor, resting in a silence the entire town had unknowingly walked past countless times. When investigators informed the family, the room shifted into a stillness that couldn't be described. His mother didn't speak at first. She held the edge of the table, gripping it as if the world beneath her feet had cracked. For 6 years, she had lived in a limbo more torturous than certainty. Every missing person poster, every false sighting, every rumor had kept a small door open in her heart. Now that door closed, not gently, but with a finality that left her trembling. Yet there was something else, something unexpected. Alongside devastation came a faint, fragile thread of closure. It wasn't peace, it wasn't relief. It was the quiet truth of finally knowing, the truth that Evan didn't wander into danger alone, the truth that he wasn't forgotten, even in the darkest hours, the truth that the silence wasn't their fault. In the days that followed, the town struggled with its own reckoning. Parents who once let their children roam freely now walked them to their doors. Park staff reviewed every blind spot, every camera angle, every neglected policy that had once made the community feel safe. Because someone had exploited those blind spots. Someone had slipped through their trust and comfort and used it to hide a crime so close, yet so invisible. Ridley was never found. He had vanished long before the trail went cold, but his absence didn't escape suspicion. Authorities believed he fled once he sensed pressure from the early investigation, possibly changing his identity or moving far from the region. His journals ended abruptly months after Evan disappeared, replaced by blank pages that held nothing but silence. And yet, in an unexpected twist of fate, a dog just doing what humans could not had unearthed the clue that set everything in motion. A trained nose, unclouded by human doubt, had found the hidden truth buried in the ravine. It unraveled 6 years of unanswered questions, leading investigators back to a man who had always been there, just outside the edges of suspicion. The truth beneath the surface was darker than anyone imagined, but it was the truth all the same. Evan's story didn't end in mystery anymore. It ended in revelation, a hard, painful revelation that stripped away the last illusions of safety the community once believed in. The family buried the remains in a small ceremony, surrounded by people who had searched, volunteered, hoped, and prayed alongside them for years. They placed the blue blanket with white stars, now part of the evidence, returned to them next to the small wooden casket. His mother rested her hand on it, whispering something only she could hear. The closing chapter of the case didn't bring justice. It didn't bring a perpetrator in handcuffs. But it brought a truth their hearts had long been prepared to confront. Evan wasn't lost. He didn't vanish into the unknown. He had been here all along, hidden in silence, waiting to be found. And in a way no one expected, a single clue uncovered by instinct, persistence, and the loyalty of a search dog had given him back to them. The forest had held its secret for 6 years, but in the end, it was the smallest disturbance beneath the soil that revealed the story everyone feared but needed to know. A truth buried, exposed at last. A truth that changed everything.